right. We are today with Rabbi Irving Yitz Greenberg, a legend of American Jewry. And first of all, I don't know if you knew this, but the two of us are both musmachim of the same yeshiva, Yeshiva Beis Yosef, Novardok. So,
Happy to hear that.
First of all, I don't think there's anyone alive today that lived American 20th century American Jewry like you. From knowing all the players, knowing all the different people, you actually need no introduction because everyone knows about the work you've done, your friendships with Rabbi Soloveitchik and so many others. So if you can just, if it's okay, because I'm a big fan of American Jewish history, can you just share with me what it was like to go to Beis Yosef Novardok in the 1950s? We're not even 10 years after the Holocaust. What was that like?
Good. What years were you there? Just for my information,
I was there, I think, a solid 50 years after you. Uh,
wow.
I was there around 2010.
Okay, yeah. Wow, okay. Now I know why I didn't meet you there. Okay.
Yeah.
Uh, um, it's an interesting story. It is a fascinating thing when I look back. Of course, it was one of the great experiences of my life, but totally unprepared for it. I was, I grew up in an immigrant home. My father was a Talmid Chacham, and he was a rabbi of a Chevra Shas in Borough Park, and the Shochet also. But his great, I say we were modern Orthodox in the sense that we're totally observant, but he had this dream, my mother too, that their child will be American, will become an American boy. I went to the standard. I mean, my joke about that is, of course, my name is Yitzchak, and I'm named after a great grandfather, but they never called me anything other than Yitzchak. But when they put on my birth certificate, they didn't want to stigmatize me as a hopelessly greener with the name Yitzchak, so they put Irving, which in those days that Jewish parents thought would be all-American name. So
Irving
many
and
Jewish,
Bernard, those were the
so
names.
many Jewish mothers named Yitzchak Irving or Moshe Morris that the WASPs dropped the name and Irving became a Jewish name. Anyway, to come back to the main story, I went to the standard modern Orthodox process, meaning in Borough Park, there was a yeshiva called Eitz Chaim at the time. Then the high school was Yeshiva University High School of Brooklyn. And I was planning to go to Yeshiva College. My father, as I said, was a Talmid Chacham who taught in the Beis Medrash downstairs in Temple Bethel, which was the fanciest Orthodox shul in Borough Park.
Still is.
Our house was 39th, 49th and 13th Avenue. Beis Hill was 48th and 15th. On the way there, he passed by Yeshiva's Beis Yosef, which was an immigrant refugee yeshiva, came over probably in 46 or 47 after the Shoah. And sometimes he was tired. He would drop in and stop or rest there on the way to the. And he got into conversations with Rosh Yeshiva. Anyway, one day the Rosh Yeshiva, I was in my graduating high school for 1949. The Rosh Yeshiva says to him,
Rosh
"We're
Yeshiva Rabbi
thinking."
Avram Yafin, who was the Rosh Yeshiva?
Rabbi Yafin, Rav Ram Yafin,
Yeah.
says to him, "We're thinking of taking in American boys." This was Beis Yosef's great dilemma all along. When I came there, which was in '49, the school was about 40 people altogether. All had come together, stayed together. Half of them were in the concentration camps, and half of them were Siberian labor camps. Rav Nekritz, the Rosh Yeshiva's son-in-law, who was the mashgiach and really the one who I became closest to, um, he was sent to Siberia, as many other Bachrim. I mean, part of the communist perfidy was that they treated the Jews who managed to come across the border from Poland, where they were being killed, they treated them like the potential spies, and they sent them off to Siberia to lay slave labor camps. Anyway, when I showed up at the yeshiva, I'll come to them, they were half and half. And if Beis Yosef was from the Novardok school, which was the most, you might say, radical, extreme, I don't know, intense version of Mussar, the Mussar movement.
Hmm.
So the truth is they had a serious hesitation about letting in outsiders. They had been together through so much, including coming to America. And I guess in their heart of hearts, they didn't really believe that American boys can meet these standards of intense Mussar and so on. So they did it 2 or 3 times when I was there, meaning I was one example, but a couple of years later, they tried again. They said, we'll try, we'll let an American boy. Anyway, he says to my father, we're thinking of letting in American boys. Do you know anybody who might be interested? My father comes home. I hope I'm not taking too long. My father comes home, says to me, this Beis Yosef, I'm really impressed with them. The Rosh Yeshiva said to me, thinking of taking in American boys, would you be interested? I said, how do I know? I have no idea who they are. I said, what do you think of them? Do you think I should consider it? He said, I'll tell you, I don't know about the Mussar part. My father was a Litvak, not a Mussarik at all. I don't know about the Mussar part, he said, but I'll tell you, I've spoken to Rav Yafet many times. He's a big Talmud Chacham. So you would have a good shear. You'd have a good, if you go there, so you should check it out. Okay. So we said, we'll check it out. We go, how do we go check it out? Again, I was very naive, we decided we'll go at night. There's a third session. There's a morning
Night
shiur,
Seder.
there's a night shiur, night seder. The night seder doesn't even have this, it was a poor judgment because there's no formal shiur. So I wouldn't know what the Rosh Yeshivas are like or what the teachers are like. So what do I know? But we went. And we're sitting there, as my father and I are learning, and all the other Bochum are at the different tables. And we're sitting there learning. So the only thing that's different, I had no idea. 15 minutes, 20 minutes before Mariv, they learn Mussar b'spilus. Spilus means you don't just intellectually study, you emotionally. You try to drive the emotion and the thoughts and the feelings into you in a very powerful way. So we're sitting there learning, and suddenly I hear a clap. Someone gives a clap on the table, and I realize a minute later that the whole place has gone quiet. My father and I are still talking, but everybody else is quiet. So I stop and I look around. Suddenly, from the table opposite me, a bacher jumps up. And at the top of his lungs, I'll never forget it, he starts to screaming, Hakina, Hataiva Varkovod, Motzin Esarim Olam. Jealousy and the desire for covet drives you out of this world. He shouts it. He jumps up. He dances it. He sings it. He cries it. For the next 20 minutes, that's his text. And that's what he's emotionally expressing. But the whole place explodes. A different table, a different text. So there may be 15, 20 texts. People are laughing.
And everyone's going on the table?
Screaming. No, I mean, it was like it was a bedlam, but it was like a storm. And
Wow.
I never in my life had heard, crying, screaming, begging, chanting. It's such intensity and such feeling. So I sit there stunned for 15 minutes, at the end of which I turned to my father and said, I'm going here. I had
I'm
no
out.
idea what I was getting involved, but I knew I had never had in my regular yeshiva education anything of this intensity or emotional power. So I went. And of course, again, I had 2 or 3 other American boys at that in my year.
Wait, so you saw this and you decided you want to go or that you don't want to go?
No, I did want to go because, again, as I said, I never saw such an emotionally powerful religious experience. And I didn't know what I was getting into, but I just said, I was very attracted and very pulled to the emotional power. I mean, again, modern Orthodoxy, I still am a modern Orthodox Jew, but I had never had this kind of complete emotional, total, emotionally let yourself go into it. And I thought it was something I would really like to know more about or experience. Now, when I went there again, I will say for the record, they never fully made up their mind about how much they want to let in Americans. So I got into some of the activity. I suspect to this day, maybe not into the inner Kodesh Kodashim sanctum, because, for example, they had Vad, they had what they call was Bursa. People would go around from table to table and discuss or raise issues or discuss personal questions. Again, the whole point of Mussar is that you're not just learning intellectually the Gemara, and for that matter, it's not just about limud Torah. It's also about working on your personal behavior and your character and your midos and trying to change them. And so they had various things like the VAD was a small group, 4 or 5 people, but they were sort of together regularly, and they would meet once or twice a week. It depends. Sometimes more rarely, more or less often.
Hmm.
And you would come and you would report on your personal mitos, what you were working on, what you were trying to improve. Maybe I'm trying to overcome my anger. I'm trying to overcome jealousy, whatever. And you would tell what you did. Another example was we kept diaries. This was based on Mendel Lappin, it was a sefer called Cheshbon HaNefesh. He picked 13
Which they
midos.
attribute to Benjamin Franklin for some reason.
Correct. Turned out later he had gotten it from Benjamin Franklin. But you take 13 midos, that means you have a cycle of 13 4 times a year. And for a whole week, you work on this particular midah. Menuchas HaNefesh, inner peace, or charitzos, being energetic and getting up early and working hard at, and not simply dawdling and not procrastinating. Different midos, kindness, and patience and so on. And for a whole week, you'd focus on that. And anytime something came up that involved this midah, you'd write it down in the book. And again, the VAD's a very powerful experience. I mean, you sit there and 3 or 4 people who you respect and who are peers, and they will listen to you, and sometimes they'll really critical, be devastating. You think you're dealing with this, you're ignoring it, you're dodging it, you're not facing up to it. It could be very critical, very devastating, but it was very powerfully influencing. And I fell in love with them, particularly with Rav Nekritz, who was the mashgiach, he was the son-in-law.
Mhm.
He had gone through Siberia. I fell in
Wow.
love with.
I
Was
mean, I knew his son when he was in
an
Novardok.
incredible, it's incredible
He
Balmidos.
was when I was there. He's still
He
there.
was so patient. He had a little son, Daniel, at the time. He grew up, could be a big boy, but at the time he was maybe 8, 9, 10. He was a very rambunctious kid and he would many times come into the basement, and even during the shiur, he would come to see his father, whatever. And he was sometimes very, naughty, or he'd argued. I never saw his father get angry. I never saw him get impatient. Anyway, I fell in love with them and wanted to be like them. And it was a very extraordinary experience. And Neckwitz, among other things, he'd give a shiur. He gave a regular Talmud shiur, but he also gave a Mussar shmuyas roughly once a week. And I would listen to that. And also once in maybe 2 weeks, depends, could be more often, less often, he would sit down with you and he'd make an appointment. And he'd go through again with your midos and what he thinks you should be working on and what he thinks you've accomplished and so on. And he would give you activities, or he'd give you text to study. And again, as I said, I admired them very much and wanted to be them. So it was a very emotional experience. And again, they didn't talk that much. I look back now, they didn't talk that much about the concentration camps. A little bit, a little bit. It's funny. I have more stories that I remember from the slave labor camps, including the one that I remember extremely profound impact on me. One of the Bachram told me the story about Rav Nekritz himself when they were sent to the Siberian gulag camps, and then the first Shabbos there, they woke them up and they told them they have to go to work. And they said they're not going to do it. So they stood up, and Nekritz was the leader of the group. So he up and said, "We're sorry, we are committed, we're bound. Torah, we don't work on Shabbos." And the guy was, of course, very upset, shocked, whatever. He got very angry and said, "How dare you? In this place, you have no rights. You have to listen to us. Whatever we tell you to do, you have to do." Robert Eckert said to him, we have a higher,
Higher authority.
we have a higher authority here. Mushbah homemade with Parsina, we're not going to do it. So the guy pulled out his gun. And he pointed. He said, "You're going to work, or I'll shoot you right here." And as Rabbi Necritz opened his prisoner's uniform, like bearing his breast, and opened it and said, "Go ahead, shoot."
Wow.
And the guy backed down.
Wow. That's
The guy backed
pretty
down.
amazing.
The guy backed down. Anyway, so again, having gone through such intense experiences, I don't blame them for hesitating about American boys. So as I said, they did let me come and participate, and as I said, I thought it was very emotionally very powerful experience. So
Mhm.
that's I spent. Now the other interesting twist about Beis Yosef is that um, they had this tremendous emphasis on Zikui Harabim. Actually, they read a sefer called Madregas Adam, which was you might say it was the speeches written down and maybe written out of the founder of Yosef Yosef Horowitz, who was the founder of Novardok, and they
Mhm.
were the extreme. In fact, when I say they were the extreme, I was lucky, I feel in retrospect, because in Europe they were considered extreme, and their goal was to break your ego, to break your ego.
Mhm.
Others, the Slobodka school, try to say you have to channel your ego, you have to improve. They were out simply, and they would do extreme things to train people not to be scared or not to be influenced by other people's opinion. If you have the right value or the right attitude, it's you and Hashem. You don't budge, you don't budge, you don't let. And so they would in Europe they did crazy things almost. I would say they would send someone into a pharmacy, and he'd say, I'd like a pound or an ounce of your Shemayim, because they told me there's a place you can get medicine, and that's sort of medicine that I need. And
Mhm.
again, of course, in many cases, the storekeeper or the customers would laugh at them, but that's the point. They were training them not to care if who cares what this ignorant folks say about laugh at you or say you're wrong. If you understand what you stand for, it doesn't let you affect you. Again, looking back, I feel they would help a lot. In my later career, I had many experiences where sort of it was a minority viewpoint and a lot of people didn't agree with it.
But the
And
Novardok gave you the strength.
I felt they gave me good training. I mean that seriously. I mean that seriously.
Mhm.
Of course, it worked both ways. They said, praise, you should not let praise go to your head either. In other words, you shouldn't be uplifted by praise any more than you should be thrown down by criticism. You have to sort of, as I say, understand what really matters, what's really the truth, and stick by that. So it's you and Hashem, but not what public opinion or the community or the Amcha cares about.
Wow. You know, it's interesting. I had the honor of learning by Rav Zelig Epstein. He was an altar mirror, and he
Right.
learned, and I don't know, he learned. He was in Kelm for some time. Part of it was, I think, during the war. But I asked him about the Mussar movement and what it was in Europe and what it is today. And he told me that after the Holocaust, the Mussar movement ceased to exist. It never, ever transplanted. And I'm curious to your thoughts on that because it does seem that in a way the Novardok that you had in Brooklyn was somewhat of what it was in Europe.
No, but it was. But you see, he's right, and I've thought of this many times. When you think later, like Lakewood or Aaron Cutler, they came over, and Rav Aaron Cutler decided just the opposite, that American boys are their future. They understood that the refugees are not going to be here forever. So
Hmm.
they made up their mind they can run a yeshiva, making demands at the same level or more as they demanded in Europe, and they're not going to make any compromises, and that the American boys will fit in and take up this set of values. That was in a working back, that was Beis Yosef's mistake. In other words, in a
Meaning
way,
you think they should have taken more Americans.
they should have made not only taken more Americans, they should have made this their commitment that we're going to sink or swim by getting American boys to live by our principles and our values.
Wow.
And here, and as I said, so half the people they let in didn't like the Mussar and they didn't push it because in part because they felt, oh, it's American, that's what it is, they're not up to it. And then they hesitated to go all out. So of course the answer is that the Bachram stayed there with them 10 years, 15 years, they aged out. Some of them left because they wanted to make a living, have families. So in the end, they basically aged out rather than transplanting. And
Wow.
I think it's very sad.
Wow, you grew up in America that in some ways many people see as a sort of a renaissance. You have Rav Hutner, the Satmar Rebbe, Rabbi Soloveitchik, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, all these people building communities and creating extraordinary things. But at the same time, I feel like there's a part of the story that's not told, which is that this is all just, a decade, not even after the Holocaust, after the greatest destruction in the history of our people. In what way do you see the Holocaust as sort of the backdrop to Chaim Berlin, to Satmar, to all these Lubavitch, all these people creating communities, but at the same time, it's important to note that they're dealing with people who lost everything.
That's correct. And again, by what you said, if you want to phrase it another way, I tell people all the time, we're living in one of the greatest ages of Jewish history, because when you think about that, it was total churban. And look what they did. In other words, instead of look, the best thing is the state of Israel itself. I mean, I feel the Nazis really destroyed. It was like not just one world; they destroyed hundreds of worlds. I mean, Beis Yosef before the war in Poland, they had Zikri Harab, and each student, when he got smicha, was supposed to go out and organize a yeshiva ketana. So they had maybe 60 to 80 schools, yeshiva ketana, all over Poland. The
Mhm.
Nazis wiped them all out. The handful that escaped, going into Siberia, or the handful that survived the camps, but all those worlds were destroyed, and one could go on
Wow.
and on. And again, I want to say again, you have to. There was another story I remember I once heard. Rabbi Israel Mavshavitz, he was the old mashgiach, and old literally, he was an old man. And the truth is, he was, I wouldn't say he was overbuttled, but he was, he was old. And I remember many times he'd sit there in the base medrash and he'd sort of fall asleep. And I didn't really take him, that seriously. I never got that. I was once talking with one of the Bakan, I said, I'm sure, he's a nice guy and we all
Yisrael,
work.
who? What's the last name?
Mavshavitz was
Moshe.
his
Oh,
name.
sure. Yeah, yeah.
So I said to him, sort of I have critically, in other words, I don't see what he does. He doesn't give shiurim, he doesn't give shmuyas, and he just hangs out there. Well, of course, it was because they respect him. He had been the mashgiach back in Europe. Anyway, but in talking to them, he says, the student says to me, again, he said he's a person who's worked out his behavior, his character was such incredible. He used to give shiurim. He doesn't give shiurim anymore, doesn't give shmuyas anymore. But so he told me the story. He said, our yeshiva, he was the mashgiach, and he was there in together. I guess maybe it was in the Novardok itself. I don't remember anymore. The advanced yeshiva, the Nazi army came into town, and it rode through town. And I guess when they saw Jewish symbols or Jewish signs, so they're sitting in the base medrash. The Nazi troops come rolling through the tanks, there's all motorcycles, and apparently somebody saw the Jewish sign. So they machine gunned at the base medrash. Well, he said when the bullets started flying, everybody jumped to the floor, panically. Obviously, they tried to escape the bullets. He said, Rabbi Israel, he was so calm. He wasn't scared by, he closed his Gemara sort of thoughtfully and then got down under the tables slowly. In other words, he had built such a level of
Hmm.
internal menuchas hanefesh that bullets didn't scare him. It didn't. I
Wow.
mean, so again, that's the kind of personal growth and development they achieved in their work. Anyway, to get back to the main point, but again, they all this was wiped out.
Wow.
And
It's
I tell people, the Jewish people, the Churban it's the greatest Churban. It's far greater than the Churban bias. I mean, first of all, 6 million. We
it's
think
unfathomable.
In the Roman wars, maybe 1 million Jews died. I
Hmm.
don't mean to make light of it, because everyone is a olam mole,
Hmm.
but still, it was a much greater Churban. And the way I say it is, it's like a total outburst of death on life. It's not just they killed Jews. They created what Ali Wiesel called the kingdom of night. They created a world. It was a death world. In other words, Auschwitz was designed that the workers and the inmates, 90% were gassed on the spot, but the other 10% were worked to death. So it was created to great death. So the Jewish people went through the greatest attack of death on people anywhere in the world history. And they wanted to kill every last Jew.
Um, you
Now,
know, uh,
they
yeah,
did not break them. This is the point I want to make. It did not break them. And after the war, Israel represents the greatest outburst of life in Jewish history. I mean, think of millions of people and building from scratch and creating a whole world. The other example I give, I heard it from Rabbi Wogelanter, who was, tomorrow was, he changed his name, who was the chief rabbinate in 1961, my first time in Israel. He said to me, he did a study. How many Jews got killed in the Shoah? 6 million. That was 30% of the whole world Jewish population. But if you ask how many Talmidei Chachamim, how many rabbis, how many Talmud scholars were killed in that 6 years, the answer is he estimates 80%, because 90% of Polish Jewry was killed, and most of the Talmidei Chachamim, most of the full-time students of Talmud, most of the full-time rabbis of teaching Talmud
yeah.
were
I
all
mean,
in Poland and in
you look at
Russia.
the Hasidus called Alexander. Nobody knows what it is today, but in Poland it was one of the biggest Hasidic courts. Yeah, the
Correct.
entire
Yeah,
world
so
wiped out.
so Idamar's point was 80% of the living Talmidei Chacham teachers of Talmud were wiped out in those 6 years. But by the time I spoke to him, this was 1961, and today it's 10 times more. We rebuilt the yeshivos in Europe, in Israel alone, and now in the whole Jewish world. There were more people studying Talmud full time. There were more Talmidei Chachamim, more Rosh Yeshivas teaching than ever before in Jewish history. So
Mhm.
that you think about it, from the total depths of death and destruction to the incredible heights of recreation and life. That's what the whole generation did. And yes, people like Rav Moshe and people like others who came from the other side, Rav Cutler and so on, they rebuilt. And for that matter, the survivors in general. It's an amazing story. You think about it, the Palestinians, part of their self-destruction is this victimization feeling. We had this Nakba, and now I'm a refugee, and what can I do? The Jews didn't sit around saying I'm a victim. They got up and they went to a new country, in this case, America, but in other cases in Eretz Israel. A quarter of a million survivors went to Eretz Israel.
Mhm.
And they built all over again, and they didn't self-pity, and they created more than ever before. And instead of turning to hatred and trying to kill the Jews, they turned to life and to Torah. I mean, it's an
I do,
incredible accomplishment.
I do want to ask you about that because I think in Israel there's this strong sentiment since October 7th, and I think in general it's a question to me as a Lithuanian Jew. I'm sure you know a bit about Abba Kovner and you know the people who discuss the possibility of revenge.
Revenge.
Did you see any of that among the survivors? Did any of them obsess about Germany? Did any of them have strong desire for revenge? What was the feeling of people who lost everything, their families and everything? What was their feeling?
I didn't experience that. That's I say. That's to me. That's also part of it. Again, maybe I should have been more. Maybe I should have been more tuned in. I just look back. I sort of feel I was a naive American boy. What did I know about suffering? What did I know about, what they had gone through? But anyway, but I almost never heard. That was that. They weren't talking about. They weren't interested in that. As I said, I'm looking back now. They didn't tell that many stories about living through the Shoah themselves. It's funny. I mean, I was sort of aware they didn't deny it, but they didn't talk about it that much. And it's funny because me personally, emotionally, after I finished Beis Yosef, I went to. I started to say before, they planted in me this idea of Jewish education, bringing Torah to the masses. Having said that, I came in with a different vision, which was to become an American. So my version of that was to get a PhD and become an academic.
Hmm.
And the truth is, they planted this in me, but I didn't act on it. In 1961, after I got my PhD ready, and after I became a professor, we went to Israel for a year, and I stumbled into the show. I say stumbled into it because I was certainly aware of it from them before, but I had never thought about it deeply or really gotten emotionally involved. And here it threw me for a loop. It knocked me over. It really took over my life. And it was, of course, it was a religious as well as a personal crisis. I mean, how could Hashem let this happen? Well, look at how could the Jewish people be treated this way? And so on. So it was a major crisis. But that's when I became totally immersed and took over my life, trying to wrestle with the Shoah. And that's when I decided not
It,
to go
it,
forward with academia, but to go into Jewish activity,
mhm.
Rabbi of a shul and things of that. So in other words, it really changed my direction. But so I started looking back. I felt like Beis Yosef planted the seeds,
Hmm.
but I didn't let them come out until my life was changed. It's just an
Let me
interesting.
just ask quickly about that because you personally, your parents were survivors or were not,
No, no, they came over before the war.
right?
That's why I'm alive, frankly.
But I guess my question is, where did the intimate connection to the Shoah come into your life? What was the first? Was it just knowing all these survivors in Yeshiva Beis Yosef? Was it knowing someone else? How did it come to impact you so personally at that age?
Well, again, the answer is, in retrospect, there was early experiences. There's two. One I think I remember. I say that
Hmm.
I think I remember. There were times my father came over in 1925,
Hmm.
and they didn't know the show I was coming. But they decided they want a better life in America, and Poland, of course, was anti-Semitic, and the Jews discriminated. So my father came over, and he had to earn money. Took him 4 years till he had enough money to bring my mother. I had three sisters who were born in Poland, older sisters. After they came to America, my older brother and I were born in America. So they came from that Polish, but they were not survived. Now, in the 30s, as they became better established in America, they tried to convince their families to join them in America. My
Hmm.
mother left behind four brothers. She
Hmm.
had six brothers. One left to America decades before. Another went to Mexico. The other four lived in Wamja, where my mother grew up, and they
Wow.
were still there. And the mother's family was still there. They had a store that the mother's family owned and ran, and a couple of the brothers helped out. Anyway, the point is, so they did not experience Shoah. However, I do have a think of, so they tried to convince them. And I say they tried. My mother's four brothers, none of them came. My
Mhm.
father had three sisters in his family, and only one came because she was not married. So she had
Wow.
nothing to lose. The other two sisters had large families. They didn't want to move. I
Hmm.
understand that. My
Hmm.
point is, so they tried to convince him to come, and they didn't. Well, of course, they felt terrible. And as the reports came in World War II, and slowly that was happening, they were more and more. So I think I recall my mother and my father they go into their room, they'd close the door so the kids, they try to spare us. And my mother crying. And I'm looking back, I think it's because they had reports. They heard, they didn't
Hmm.
know exactly what was happening, but they heard that they're being killed. And they realized, and they always felt their whole life they talked about what a failure. How come they didn't get? But of course, it wasn't their fault. No one
Who
took
knew,
it.
right? God
No
only
one
knows.
who knew who thought.
Right.
That's number one. Number two is after the war, again, this is maybe 46 or 47. My father got a visit from a second cousin. Her name was Shifra Tonovsky. I remember the name. And she came with her daughter. And she came from Sokol, my father's hometown. And she told him what happened basically was the Einsatzgruppen, the Nazi shooting squads, came to their town. They rounded up all the Jews and they shot them to death. She survived with her child because when they were shooting, they fell into the pit among all the other people, most of whom were wounded or dead. And she lay buried in that. She survived by lying in the in the pit with all the dead bodies. And 24 hours later that night, when the Nazis left, she climbed out. That's how she survived. But she told my parents again that my parents didn't let me sit in on this conversation. But she told them she's alone survived, but the rest of the family, did not survive. They were just all shot and killed right then and there. So again, I remember the aggravation, the sadness, and my parents, again, they wouldn't talk to us, but you could tell something was going on there. So that, and again, I did have some stories from the Beis Yosef, but not a lot. So the point is, it was there, but it was certainly not a central thing. In 1961, I was an academic and I went to Israel on a Fulbright to teach American history at Tel Aviv University. And we would, and it's funny, but I can date it exactly. We started in Tel Aviv, but then we moved to Jerusalem because again, religious Jews, you want to be in Jerusalem. So I would say probably the summer, at the end of the summer of 61, we moved to Jerusalem. The week we moved to Jerusalem, I get a call from a personal friend who's an academic in Israel. And he calls me and says, he said, the Eichmann trial is finishing up this week. The judges are reading the rulings. It's near the very mamish, the very end. No one can get tickets. I can get us tickets. Would you like to go? So I confess, I looked back, I thought about him and I said, no, I don't have to go. I can read about it in the papers.
Newspaper. Wow.
Now, of course, about a week later or 2 weeks later, I really don't know exactly what, suddenly it hit me. I started to read. And of course, the more you read, the more devastating and the more it
Right.
took over my life. So it completely took over my life.
Wow.
For the rest of the year, I spend 4 hours a week, 2 hours, 2 days a week, traveling to Tel Aviv and teaching my seminar, American History. I'd come back, and all the rest of the time I was sitting and reading. I went to Yad Vashem, I was reading. Those days, Yad Vashem was neglected, it was run down. I
Right.
remember in the winter, it was freezing cold. And yet, of course, it was what was reading was
Yeah.
chilled you to the bone.
If it's just okay if I can pause you here, if
Sure.
it's okay that we break and we'll continue in a next episode. Is that okay?